I'm pretty excited because today, this entire space is gonna start to change. After 7 years of adding tools and projects and junk, this space is completely out of control, but I've been working on kind of a system of thought to be able to organize any space with a whole bunch of stuff in it. We got a lot of work to do. Let's give it a shot. Over the past few months, I've been renovating this entire basement to make it a place where our entire family can hang out. It had a bunch of junk in it before, and when I cleared this out, all that junk had to go somewhere. And most of it ended up here in my office, which is now a wreck, but it made me realize that this used to be my storage room, which means I don't have a storage room, but I obviously need a storage room. And so that led me to think, well, this space is not utilized very well. Why don't I build a storage room right there? But if all that stuff comes here, then that means this stuff has to be redone. And maybe it can't move because it has to connect to the exhaust, or this pole's in the way. So then I have to rethink how I do this section, which means this stuff then has to move here. But I can't put stuff here because it's a walkway and it goes that way. And there's already a bunch of junk here that needs to be taken to the recycling center. And I haven't taken that because of this and because of that, and it just goes around in a big circle. So I decided that I need to stop trying to spin all these plates in my head. And I need to come up with some sort of a system that's mine, and I'm sure other people have done the exact same thing, but I needed to write out a formula for myself that I can apply to each one of these sections and the space as a whole. I think my little plan of thought will actually work with any space. Like, I'm thinking about my walk-in closet, but today I wanna go through a couple of areas in the shop as examples, and then we're gonna actually apply it to the woodworking area and move everything around and see if it gets better. Bob from the future here. This video ended up being pretty long, but covering a whole lot of stuff, and I really want it to be useful for you. So I'm gonna take my process here and boil it down to a worksheet that you can download for free to help organize your spaces. I'll show it to you later on. But of course, I've got a little disclaimer I want to throw out there. We're different. You and I are different. We have different spaces with different stuff. We do things differently. And so the way I think about this may not be the way that you think about it. In fact, I know for a fact that a lot of you watch Adam Savage, and he does a lot of organization stuff, and it's great. But it may not be the way you do it. It's definitely not the way I do a lot of it, and that's cool. That's good that we're different. And my hope is that this kind of framework idea thing is just something that we can all apply to our own situations. But I want to give you an example. Think about sorting Lego. If you're not a Lego person, this won't even matter to you, but if you are, this might be a divisive conversation. There's two ways that most people sort their Lego bricks. One is by color, and one is by function, which to me is a much better way to do it. So by color, people literally just pick all of the orange bricks and they put them in a box. And they do that for every single color so that they know where to find the orange ones when they want one. But for me, I actually like function a lot better because I need a sloped piece or a tire. And once I have the sloped pieces, I can pick out the orange brick if that's what I'm looking for. And neither one of those things are wrong. If you're building a tiger, then orange matters the most. If you're building a race car, then function matters the most. Those are both just different ways to use the same tools, and that's kind of the same situation with the shop. Okay, that's out of the way, so now I get to tell you the idea for this entire place, and it starts with splitting it into smaller rooms. I'm blessed with a very large shop. It's about 1,100 square feet. And I know a lot of people immediately are like, why in the world would you cut that into smaller spaces? Again, it's the Lego sorting idea. It's what I need right now. And so the plan is to take what is a big space where everything is connected and everything runs over each other and split it into spaces that are a little bit more dedicated for things that I'm interested in today. I want to break this into 3 big areas, maybe 4. One is the wood shop. This is a very important part of what I do, and I don't want to change that too much, but I do want to contain it. Then I need storage, so I want to take this area and actually turn it into a dedicated, sealable kind of storage organization thing, where I can store a whole bunch of stuff in kind of a small space. And behind me, I actually want to build a room that's sealed off from the rest of the space to keep dust out, because that is what I'm calling the clean room. That's where I want to put all of my 3D printers, my vinyl cutters, my large format printer, all of that stuff that needs to be away from the shop, but I want it to have a dedicated space. Now there's a lot of stuff to consider in this big space, and I can't do it all at one time, and I can't even do it all in this one video. So that leads me to my first big decision point, which is, what is my top singular priority for the entire space first? And for me personally, I wanna be able to walk in here and immediately make something. I wanna remove the barriers to get an idea out through a tool. So being able to easily make stuff is probably my top priority. After that, you have to come up with a secondary priority. It's not top priority, but it's still really important. And for me, that's presentation. I need to be able to show you what I'm making, which means I need to make it easier for you to focus on what I'm doing. I need to remove background noise and distraction and bad lighting and bad sound and things like that. I need to make it shootable. So for me, those are the two big priorities for the entire space, and I'm gonna have to do that same decision for each one of the individual spaces as I get there. It's really important that you get your main priority and then probably a secondary priority, maybe a third, but honestly, if you go past that, nothing's a priority. It's just a bunch of stuff that you want that all weighs the same. You need to figure out what weighs the most in your mind and work from there. But even once you have those priorities, it's still pretty hard to deal with a bunch of stuff. So the next step is to aggressively remove things, like aggressively. Like most makers, this is actually kind of difficult for me. I never want to throw away a scrap because I might need it. There's some weird motor that might be useful someday. There's a project piece that's left over that I don't want to get rid of because it was a cool memory. This tool was useful one time, so maybe I should just keep it around. There's all these things that kind of make us want to hold on to stuff. And some things, yes, you should hold on to. But if you haven't used something in a year or two or longer, if you've had a piece of wood that you've never actually used, it's just cool and it's been around, maybe look at just getting rid of it. Find somebody else that can use those things. Find a place that you can donate them. I know for me, one of the things I've never done is recycle metal, but we have a metal recycling place here. I've got tons of offcuts of aluminum and steel, and so one of my jobs is to take all of that, get it out of the shop, and get a few dollars for it. I've also got woodworking tools that I rarely use, but my sister has become a woodworker, and she could use the planer or the lathe, and so I'm gonna take those to her house and let her use them, and if I ever need them, I'll just go borrow them. And as far as the scrap thing, here's a little tip, and I don't know where I heard this, but if you find a piece of wood that's cool and you want to hang on to it as a scrap, just take a pencil and write the date on the bottom of that piece. Then, when you're cleaning out your shop in a couple of years, if you find scraps that have been there for a year or two and you haven't used them, put them in the burn pile or find another woodworker that might want them. Now there's a whole lot more stuff that I plan on getting rid of. I just can't do it all today, but so far it's made a huge difference. There is so much more space in every area. There's fewer things from my mind to try to figure out what to do with. I mean, my honest advice would be just give things away, get rid of stuff, have less stuff to deal with, and it's gonna make all this easier. Now, we need to move on and start applying the idea to the storage area. Now the storage area that I'm talking about is right behind me. It's from this pole right here where I'm gonna build the wall for the clean room all the way to the lumber storage, which I'll probably have to rebuild and change eventually. But it's the area that you see in this frame right now. As I start to figure out what I need for this space and figure out what the priority is for it, I wanna make sure that I'm verifying upward to the big picture. The big picture was, I wanna be able to walk in here and make stuff with very little friction, and I wanna be able to shoot it. So as long as my choices here work with those top level priorities, we're good. Basically, we don't have a storage room in our house, and our attic is hot and kind of hard to get to, so I need to create an area that is storage for the shop, but also for some things in our house that we want to keep, but we don't really need out all the time. I want to compress as many things as possible into this space. The problem there is that I actually have to be able to get to all of it as well, so I can't just smash things up together with no way to access them. So my two big priorities for here are as much as possible and accessible. And I mean, obviously people want to store as much stuff as possible. That sounds like kind of a duh thing to say, but it's really important because if you have shelves and then you have containers that go on those shelves, but there's a bunch of empty space around them, like these, I'm actually kind of wasting space here. All of this area right here should be inside of a container so I could make it useful, but instead stuff just gets stuck there and it's not a great option. I need to make sure that the containers I choose are more rectangular and not this goofy slanted shape. So that led me to start looking at containers, and I picked a couple that were pretty rectangular. This is a pretty good small option, and I looked at a really big option as well. But anyway, one of the problems I have is I start trying to come up with solutions too early. I don't even know what's gonna go here yet. I know that I'm gonna have archival storage, Christmas decorations, and my old stuff. I'm gonna have raw materials like paint and epoxy and things like that, and functional items, things I need to get out to use, tools that I don't use very often, but I wanna keep. And unfortunately, those categories are just too vague for me to start figuring out which containers I need and which shelves to build and stuff like that. So unfortunately, this whole section's gonna have to wait. The storage area is gonna be right there. So the next thing to think about is the new clean room. And I don't even know where the walls are gonna go yet. And all of that depends on the priorities that I set for this space. The space that I'm thinking of is gonna be roughly from here all the way to that back wall. So it's a pretty big space, and that's so that I have enough room in there to keep it flexible. But essentially, the priorities for that room are to have a clean space where I can put all of the 3D printers and large format printers and vinyl cutters and maybe even my electronic station, things that I want to be able to work on but keep dust away from them. So as a priority for this space, being able to make things more often with less friction, that matches my top level priority for the whole shop. My second level priority is good as well because I want to be able to shoot in here. That's why this room is the size that it is, so I can have several machines and an electronics desk, but still have room around those things to be able to shoot the videos. I do kind of have a third priority for this area, but it's not really about organization, it's more about discipline for myself. I want it to be focused. I don't want it to be like the rest of the shop that's kind of mingled together and there's piles of things that didn't get put away. I want this space to be tidy and minimal, and honestly, I kind of want it to look cool. I have an idea for making the room look really cool, but we'll get to that when we build the room. But thinking through this, those priorities that you have for a space are really just the first step. They are the thing that you want to get to, the ideal, but you have to deal with the actual situation, and that's where you have to start talking about constraints. And by constraints, I mean the stuff that you have to work around, the things that you have to consider. And I've kind of broken those down into three categories. First is the volume. And I literally mean the volume. The volumetric space that you are in is a constraint. You have to work around walls, you have to work around plumbing and the ceiling and AC ducts and all that stuff, but that defines your space, your volume. In this particular volume, I've got a lot of things I have to think about. I've got ducting that runs through only part of it. I've got the plumbing. There's a bedroom above this, so I have to figure out some sort of soundproofing. And then where does the wall go? Does the wall hit this pole or not? Maybe it goes on this side of it. Does it sit under this beam or on the side of it? There's a lot of different physical things that will define the volume because that's going to be the first step. After that, we have to talk about the objects in the volume. And objects are the next constraint, literally the stuff that's gonna be in the space. In the storage space, I've got a bunch of shelving and containers. Those are the objects. In this space, I'm gonna have a really big printer and a bunch of smaller printers and a desk for electronics and all of the pieces and parts and tools that go with that station. Those are all objects that I have to figure out how to fit into the volume. So you've got the space, you've got the stuff that's in the space, and the third constraint for me is interaction. It's how you deal with the tools or the things in the room. On this particular tool, I'm gonna stand here to use it, but it's not just that. If I'm pushing something through, it could very possibly stick off this way, and if it's long, it's gonna stick off that way. So I can't put this in a corner. This has to have a particular interaction, and every tool is gonna have its own. So the way that I'm actually trying to keep track of all this and figure this out for each one of these spaces is just on paper. I'm making lists. I'm writing down the tools that I want to put in here, and then next to that, what the interaction for that tool is. I need to be able to get to a printer from the front and probably from the back so that I can load in filament. I've got an absolutely gigantic printer that it's gonna go in here as well, and it's so big that I don't want it to be stuck in one place. So I have to make some sort of a cart for it to be able to kind of roll around a little bit. I'm also probably gonna have some resin printers in here, and they're kind of messy. So those need to be on a surface that's easy to clean. Obviously, we're gonna have to have really good lighting in this space, but also probably task lighting at the electronics station and maybe for working on printers. All of those interactions are downstream from the objects that are in the space. And the objects in the space are downstream from what the space actually is. That's how I came up with those three constraints. The volume has stuff, and that stuff has interaction. You gotta figure all those things out together. I've thought a lot about this, and I could continue to talk about it, but I can't actually do any of the work. I don't have walls yet. But we've gotta be able to test this out. We've gotta be able to take our priorities and our constraints and start to create solutions to problems, and we can do that in the wood shop. In general, the wood shop's gonna stay about the same, except it's gonna feel smaller because there's gonna be a wall right here. But that wall is gonna require both of these bandsaws and the miter station to move in. And that is our first problem to solve. We have more objects than we have volume, so something's gotta give. But before we solve that problem, let's talk about our priorities for the space. The top priority is exactly the same as the entire space. Immediate access to tools so I can make things with no friction. That means open walkways, everything needs to be able to be moved, and a big area on the floor for assembling things. Priority number 2 is also the same. I want to be able to shoot in here without it being distracting, but look behind me. I'm totally failing at this right now. There's all sorts of stuff behind me that's gonna draw your eye instead of to me or to what I'm making. The entire place needs to be tidier or at least better looking. I feel like I'm failing at the third priority as well. And that priority is for this entire space to be energizing to me. I wanna feel empowered, inspired to make stuff, and one of the reasons I don't is because of piles of stuff. These are all unfinished projects, and when I look at them, I kind of feel a tension, like I've got work to do, but I don't really have time to do that work. I've got things that I never put away that I need to put away. And so I've got to figure out a way to organize stuff like this so it doesn't stress me out and the space can be inspiring. We got our priorities, check, but now we got to think about our constraints. And the first one being the volume. I have to decide what constraints I am putting on my choices. That's the point of those constraints, is things that I have to have and everything else is going to work around them. And in my case, I think I have 2 constraints in here. One is this big open space, which you can't really see. It needs to be a big enough, consistent open space that I can build a piece of furniture on the floor right here. I just want to have that work area. The other thing is the table saw. With a table saw, or pretty much any other saw, you need to have in-feed space and out-feed so that you can push something in and get it out the other side. And right now, I've got plenty in both directions, and it's fantastic. Unfortunately, I don't have enough room in any other direction to move these things. So the table saw and the workbench have to stay right here. So that means that everything else in this area has to work around this empty space and those 2 giant objects. That means I don't have a whole lot of space to work with. Now, most of the things in here are already on wheels, which means they're very easy to move around, and there's a few things that they don't really need to live in the shop. I can roll them in when I need to. So I'm thinking about making kind of like a parking lot over by the storage area for a couple of these tools to get them out of the way. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. This video is sponsored by BetterHelp, and they've been sponsoring videos for about 6 months now, and the reason I wanted to do that is to bring visibility to therapy as a good thing, as a helpful tool. A lot of people will be able to find a therapist local to them or get a recommendation from somebody they trust. If you can't find a therapist, that's where BetterHelp comes in. The whole point of BetterHelp is that you go to the website, you fill out a little questionnaire about what your needs are and who you are, and usually in about 48 hours, they will match you up with a licensed therapist. From there, you can meet with that therapist on a schedule that works for you, in a way that works for you. And if you find that it's not a great fit, you can swap to a different therapist at any time, for any reason, at no cost. And you will definitely find somebody that's a good fit for you. They have a network of over 30,000 licensed therapists with tons of specialties. The point of therapy is to help you through things that you don't know how to navigate yourself and to put an objective voice into your life to help with that stuff. And if that sounds even remotely useful to you in your life, please go check it out. Hit the link down in the description or go to betterhelp.com/ILTMS. That's gonna give you 10% off your first month of therapy. Just talk to somebody, see if it's a good fit for you. Big thanks to BetterHelp for sponsoring this videos, but to you watching, make sure you get the help that you need, and thanks for being here. There's a couple less things to deal with for now. Next, we got to think about interactions. Now, obviously, every tool, you have to be able to stand in front of it. Some of them you need to be able to move pieces of material around it, but that's not a big deal here because pretty much everything can be rolled out. I do want to minimize the amount of movement that I have to put on any tool. If you move them in and out a lot, it's going to get really tiring and annoying. So I just want to be able to pull them away from a wall and make sure that I can use them. But I also have to make sure that I have power available to those tools when I move them out. When I moved into the house, I wired up the shop, so I've got power pretty much every place that I would need, except right in the middle of the rooms, and these are really handy for that. This is basically an extension cord on a reel, and so you've got 25 feet or so of extension that you can take to where you need it. So I've got a couple of these mounted on the ceiling, and that gets you power anywhere you need. There's another thing about interactions in a shop that I think a lot of people just forget about, and that's the table height of everything. I like to have all of the tables really close to the same height, and that's so that everything can act as in-feed or out-feed for other tools. My table saw, my work table, my miter saw, that table over there, the little cabinet that's underneath the drill press, they're all at the exact same height. So at any point, I can use any of them to help with any task. Of course, it looks nice to have everything kind of on the same plane, but it's also just really handy. If you need a little extra table, you can just roll things together and you know they're gonna match up. You can't do this with every tool, but if you can swing it, I would suggest it. Okay, we've talked about the priorities, we've talked about the constraints, and now it's my favorite part, time to actually start making stuff better. Now, we can start creating solutions for the problems, and we're gonna go through these one at a time and just get them out of the way. So one problem that we can solve is the air compressor. I've got a long hose, so I can have it set anywhere. You could run piping if you wanted to. This air compressor can literally be anywhere in the shop that makes the most sense. And it doesn't make sense to have it here eating up floor space. I've also noticed that I have this problem with theoretical storage. I have a bunch of cabinets up here that have basically nothing in them. They're taking up a bunch of space, they're unorganized, and all this stuff could go in a much smaller container in a place that it makes sense. So these are coming down, they'll go to Goodwill, and then I'll free up a whole big space to make something useful. So I think we've established that getting rid of stuff is a fantastic way to get started with organizing. And honestly, you can just kind of keep doing it throughout the process. But now we have to start figuring out how to place all of these objects in this space. And of course, there's a million ways to do this, but I like to go to Fusion. Now, of course, to be fair, you don't have to use 3D modeling software for this. You can do it on a piece of paper. The important thing is that you measure your space. You want to measure all of the walls and the doors, obviously, but you also want to think about things that are immovable. You've got AC ducting, you've got power on the walls, you might have wiring running through the joists. Any of those things that you're going to have to work around, you want to measure where they are so you can put them in your model or on your layout plan, whether it's on paper or on the computer. Now, I like to go to Fusion just because 3D modeling is kind of how I think. I've made a course teaching people how to do this, and it may seem like it's complicated, but it's really not, and it can be very, very helpful. And one of the big advantages to having a model like this, or having a really nice piece of paper with all of these dimensions on it, is that you can come back to it later. If you're thinking about getting a new tool or building a new table, you can go back to your model and actually verify if it will fit, if it will do the thing that you want it to do in the space that you have. So spending the time to get the measurements and get this model right, absolutely worthwhile. So I started by measuring everything. I measured all of the walls, I measured where this beam is, where the ducting is, where the poles are, because all of those things are gonna be either integrated in or I'm gonna have to work around them to build the walls that I wanna put in here. And then after that, I had to measure all of the tools. If you wanted to, you could get really exact about all this and actually model these things. In fact, I have models of most of these objects, but in this case, I just got the outer cubic dimensions of them. I don't worry about the fact that this is shaped like an A. I just want to know what the footprint is and how tall it is, so I just measure those three things. In fact, with a lot of these tools, I didn't just measure the tool, I measured kind of a given space around it that I know I need to have just to make sure that I'm building in interaction. And eventually I ended up with this, a list of all of the tools that I want to have in this space, their footprint dimensions, and then separately their height. Because if you're just going to be making a model from above on a piece of paper, the height doesn't really matter. But in my case, I wanted to be able to actually have a three-dimensional block for each one of these tools, so that was pretty important. So the 3D model was super helpful for testing, for moving things around virtually to see if they would fit, to make sure that there was enough walkway and all that type of stuff. But eventually you just have to start moving stuff around, and we have one big thing that might be a problem, and it's that gigantic but awesome miter saw station. So let's talk about this thing. It's pretty fantastic. We actually have build plans if you want to build one of your own, and it's been great here, even though I've kind of wasted a lot of the space underneath it. But to move it over there is actually going to be kind of difficult. This is gonna be difficult just because it wasn't made to move. It's a station. It's supposed to be in one place. So eventually making this mobile might be the thing to do, but for now, we're just gonna take all the storage up top, separate it out so that we can just take the saw and the side tables and move the whole thing over there. Now, before I try to drag that thing all the way over here, I didn't talk about why I'm moving it here in the first place. One, because I'm gonna be putting a wall where it is currently, but why it's going on this wall in particular, well, let me just show you on the tool. I mentioned earlier about saws needing in-feed and out-feed, and on a miter saw, you have potential to cut on either side of the blade. So my hope was that I could have at least 8 feet this way and at least 8 feet this way. Well, it turns out that this wall from that corner to that corner is just under 17 feet, which means if I put the saw in the middle, I should have plenty of room on the outsides. But one of the advantages of maybe making this station mobile in the future is if I need more than 8 feet on one side, I can actually pull it away from the wall, and then I've got tons of outfeed or infeed or whatever on that side. Okay, I can't put it off any longer. I gotta try to move that thing. Now, I don't know if this is the right place for this, but without modifying it, it's the only place that it's gonna fit in this room. And this was like the big central immovable object that I had to kind of work around. Now, I've got to get the other saws and the cart and all that stuff to fit in the spaces around this. Luckily, they're mobile, so that should be a lot easier. This is the bigger of my 2 bandsaws. The other one is a little bench top that can kind of go anywhere because it's for small stuff. And typically, if you were gonna resaw boards, you would wanna have a lot of outfeed and infeed so that you can put long pieces through. I don't really do that very often. And if I ever need to, I can roll it out into this space. But for now, I'm gonna place it so that I can walk up to it and use it on stuff right here. But even in placing it here, one of the things I had to think about was it being in the way of my infeed and outfeed for this saw. So I had to make sure that this would fit above any material that was on this table, which it probably will, and it's not in the way of it coming out. So if I were to put a long board on here, it doesn't run into the bandsaw, and that's a good thing. Another thing about a tool like this is that on this side of the blade, you could actually have a really long piece of material. But on this side, it's always gonna run into this part of the saw. So if this part of the saw is up against a wall, it's no big deal. And that may not seem like a very big deal, but that's exactly why I put the tool on that side. It's up against a wall. If I put it over here, that would not be the case. This other bandsaw is like a benchtop one. It's small, and unfortunately it's sitting on a table that is not mobile. So I could either make that table mobile, or I could avoid using footprint in the shop for this thing at all. Check this out. I actually do have room over here. If I wanted to just move the table, I could stick it right there and it would work fine. Or I could use that space for something else and take advantage of some of this empty space that I've created up here. I think I can put that little saw right here and still get to it just fine. Now the problem with that is this fence. When I built this miter saw station, I put these fences here with the track in it so that I can have a stop block, and it works great, but you don't really need a fence here for anything. So these days, a lot of people put the track in the tabletop so that you have more of a clear surface. And if I do that, then I can put the bandsaw right here and move it forward if I need to. I moved the drill press over here and it's worked out great. This whole side's looking nice and open and everything has enough room. And then I moved the A-frame cart and it does not work. In the model, I had that big A-frame cart up against what's gonna be the new wall and it was fine. But in real life, it actually comes into the room way more than I want it to. So I think I'm gonna have to rethink this entire end. One of my constraints in here, which is probably a constraint for you as well, is the breaker boxes. I can't just completely cover them up with something that's permanent. I have to be able to get to them to flip breakers. That's part of why I put the drill press over here to leave a big open space. Well, since I have to move the A-frame, I can try to put it here, and since it's on wheels, if I need to get to the breaker boxes, I can roll it out of the way. Let's give it a shot. I don't really like it in the corner. Plus, it cuts into my outfeed from the miter saw, so I don't think that's gonna work. But it also made me realize that I was trying to avoid moving the TV because it's anchored into a concrete wall, but I don't even use that TV. There's no reason that it needs to be right there. So if I take the TV down and allow both of those things to just go somewhere else, the cart can go right there, and that's kind of the perfect spot for it. Turns out I had a constraint that I wasn't even aware of, but now that I've identified it, I can ignore it. I tried out a few different things, and I think I've got it how it works, but looking at it, it's almost exactly like it was before, except everything is moved over just a little bit. And I was trying to figure out why this works, but it didn't before, and I think I understand. If you put something up against a wall, it kind of creates a perimeter, a boundary out from that wall, which is where the free space in the room starts. If you put something next to it that comes at the same distance from the wall, it doesn't change that boundary. It feels about the same. But if you try to do that to a blank wall, you can really feel it. So imagine this new wall that's gonna go right here. If this is the outer boundary of the room, it's a pretty good amount of space. But if I were to put something in front of this, that boundary moves in right here, which actually really starts to change the free space on the floor. One thing I'm not good at in my house or in my shop is leaving empty wall space. I have this tendency to try to just fill every space with as much stuff as possible to make it efficient or whatever, but having a blank wall can be a huge benefit. Like for instance, right now you are paying attention to me. You are not looking at stuff in the background, you are focusing on what I'm saying to you. And if I wanted to get really serious and make a big point in the video, I could do it right now because I've got your attention. But I'm not gonna do that. Let's go move some stuff around. All right, remember these containers? Well, a lot of people will stack them up in some sort of a stand so you can roll the whole thing around and you have them all vertically, and I'll probably do that eventually because I think that's a great idea. But for now, I've already got something that holds them all and it's made to fit on the miter station. So instead of putting it on top, I think we can put it under. Now eventually, I'll probably get tired of leaning down to take out containers on the bottom, but I'm not that old yet, so I'll deal with it when I get there. For now, I'm gonna screw this in on both sides, and then I've got some extra space in the bottom where I can just kind of jam some other stuff. The entire shop looks way better and is far more organized, but there's still a pile right here and a couple of other piles of stuff that needs a home. So we're gonna put it on that wall. And to do that, I reached out to my friends at Wall Control, and they sent me enough of these panels to cover that whole 4x8 section and a bunch of doodads to organize it. So we're gonna start organizing that, knowing full well that it will change a lot over the next couple of months. In fact, it'll probably just keep changing. But step one, we gotta get these things on the wall. Every part of this has a long way to go, but I think it's good to think of your workspace, whatever it is, as a moving, kind of constantly changing thing. That way, any decisions you make don't have to be permanent and you don't have to worry if they don't work out. My goal for this particular space was to be able to walk in and immediately use the tools, have direct access with as little friction as possible, and I wanted it to be good to look at. I want it to be easy to shoot in here to show you what I'm doing. Now, even though I've got a long way to go on both of those things, I think it's way better than it was, and I'm actually really excited to start making some projects in this particular setup. Obviously, the wood shop is gonna keep changing. It's gonna be a work in progress for a long time, but next up, I've gotta jump into the clean room. Now, I wanna run through that really quickly, just in case you wanna write these things down, the little guiding principles that I've been using for trying to organize these spaces. I have my two big priorities for that room. I know exactly what I want the room to be, and anything else is gonna be lower priority. It's not important enough to put in place. Then I've written down all of the constraints. Those are the volume, literally the space that you're working in. It's all the stuff that goes in there, the objects that need to exist in that space, and the interactions. How you interact with all of those objects. Do they have to have filament loaded into them? Do you need to work in front of them or from the side? Do you have to have access from the top? All that stuff matters when you're laying out a space. Keeping all this stuff in your head is actually kind of hard, and it was really helpful for me to write it down. So like I mentioned before, we made a simple worksheet that you can download for free to help organize your thoughts and get all this stuff down for every space that you're working with, and then you can literally lay out the space and all the stuff in it. These are free. The link for them is down in the description. If you're interested, go check them out. And I hope it's helpful. I've got a lot left to do, so if you've got more suggestions or ideas about the clean room, leave them down below. I would really appreciate it. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Now it's time for bloopers. Paint and epoxy and stuff that I need to get to, plus just, what was the other container? Oh yeah. from machine to machine or area to area or something like that. Area to area. How inspire I feel, I was almost there. I'm sorry for the cough, not for messing up.